Hey there, welcome back to another episode of Integrated. My name is Angela Erickson, and this is the podcast where we seek to grow knowledge of God by coming to know ourselves and what we are made for, so that we can grow as disciples of Christ, surrendering all that we are and all that we have to the truth. This episode is a really great one. I just got done going through and editing the entire video, and actually I had pre-recorded a separate introduction, but I felt like it needed another introduction because we recorded it a few weeks ago, and rewatching the interview, I just was so struck by how awesome this interview is. So I really hope that you guys enjoy it. It's an interview with Jenny duBay. She has an apostolate called Create Soul Space, and her apostolate is focused on this issue of domestic violence. And maybe you are aware, but maybe you're not aware that October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And we talk about kind of all the tough issues surrounding domestic violence, divorce, separation, and why Jenny started this apostolate. And it's incredible. It was such a good interview. And I hope that if you're married, if you're not married, if you're a woman, if you're a man, like, you listen to this interview. We talk a lot about the psychology behind abuse and things like that, and kind of what the red flags are and how we should approach this with a Catholic lens. So I really hope that you'll give this a listen. It's just such a great interview. And make sure you go check out Jenny's work, or if you know somebody who is in a situation that maybe seems like it's maybe would warrant some more attention in this area, or if you think maybe you're in a situation that involves domestic violence, if you are the abuser, or maybe you are the victim or survivor of domestic violence, please go check out her work. I really would encourage it. You can tell she just has a great passion for it and a great insight onto the modalities of how this works, and where to find healing, and hopefully rectify things. So anyway, thank you so much. For those of you who are new here, please give this a like, share, subscribe. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit the bell so that you get notified every time I go live. And lastly, maybe consider supporting my work on Patreon. If you are open to supporting my work on Patreon, I would really appreciate it. That would mean the world to me. There's some great people there that are supporting Integrated. And I have some news, hopefully, to drop soon. Going to get some details ironed out and firmed up. But I'm really hopeful that we're going to be able to do a little bit more here on Integrated. And I'm really excited to share with you kind of where things are going with this podcast. So, and some of the work that I'm doing. So anyway, thank you so much, especially for those of you who have been supporting my work since early on, and those of you who have come on board more recently. Thank you so much. It's really amazing. I didn't know that there would be people who would want to support this. So it's very humbling. And I love that you guys are enjoying Integrated, and that we're able to bring this out into the Catholic discourse. So thank you so much. I hope that you enjoy my interview with Jenny duBay on her apostolate regarding domestic violence, and let me know what you think. I'd love to hear it. Hi, Jenny. Thank you so much for coming on to Integrated today. I'm really excited to have this interview with you. We have been talking for months now about getting you on, but we decided on October ultimately because very few people know that October is actually Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And so I'd like to have you come on and talk a little bit about this nuanced issue, especially in light of my interview with Layla Miller talking about adult children of divorce. We often know that, divorce can happen because of a domestic violence situation. And I think you are the perfect person to talk about this issue with. So thank you for coming on today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be on the show.
And like I said, if there's ever, this is a really difficult topic. And so for anyone who's listening and has come from a place where they have been a survivor of domestic violence, or wondering if maybe they are a survivor, in that kind of a situation, I really want to be sensitive to that. And I want you to know we're not I don't ever want anyone to feel like this is unilateral advice for every single person. Every situation is very different, and we're not here to condemn you if you did get away from your abuser and get divorced or something like that. That's not what the goal of this podcast is. We just really want to have a conversation about this issue. It's a very tough issue, and unfortunately I feel like it's more common now than it has been in the past. So Jenny,
Mhm.
would you mind like starting off sharing maybe bits and pieces about why this issue has become so important to you and why you've created kind of an apostolate around it?
Well, yeah, sure. So I'm a survivor myself. So I really began my ministry as a way of healing myself. Um, and then it just kind of grew from there. I didn't really think anyone would pay attention to it. And I'm like, I'm doing this for me. And then it just kind of, grew, which, I thank God for that. But it's domestic abuse is something I've experienced in my marriage. It's something that I know from my childhood. It's something my sister experienced. Unfortunately, it's all too common. The statistics say 1 in 4 women will or are in abusive marriages. And for men, it's different. I've heard 1 in 8, 1 in 10, even if it's 1 in 10, that's too many. I mean,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
and unfortunately, it's just all too common. And it took me 10 years to even realize I was in an abusive relationship, which people are like, what? I mean, you should know, right? You don't. You're just
Yeah.
like, it's a difficult marriage. That's what he says. He says, I can't communicate. He says, I'm this, I'm that, and you have no idea until, like in my case, someone else had to point it out to me.
So what are then maybe the red flags for maybe being in an abusive relationship? What are things that maybe people need to be a little bit more aware of?
Well, it's kind of crazy. Like at the very beginning, when you're dating, the first red flag is love bombing.
I
So
was
you
gonna say,
think
yeah.
that's great. And
Mhm.
so usually with abusive relationships, I'm going to say he for an abuser. And I don't mean to, if there's any males out there who are victims or survivors, please don't, I'm not acknowledging that men can be victims too, but it's just my own perspective. So,
Mhm.
um, so at the beginning, it's like he'll move really quickly, and the love bombing is like, this is Prince Charming, the man of your dream. Everything you ever wanted, he's exactly like you. So there's a lot of mirroring. So whatever you like, he likes. Whatever you hate, he hates, or don't like, or whatever. And I mean, which in any relationship really isn't possible. Everyone's their own person. You have
Mhm.
likes and dislikes. Who cares, right? But with love bombing, it's like, I mean, it's romance. It is fair.
Right.
It is like
Like
whirlwind fairy tale.
over the top though.
Over
Like
the top.
it's yeah, love bombing
Well,
really just like
over the top, but it feels good because you feel
right.
like you finally met that person. He's a gentleman, and he really pays attention to you, and you stay up late at night talking, just spilling your heart out, and you see
Mm,
someone you can really talk to, and you're like, wow, yeah, I want to move quickly because I know he's the right one.
right.
Rather than you like using discernment and being like, this feels really good, but let's slow down a little bit. And so, but then fairly cool. It is different with all relationships, but there's little signs, but little signs you don't pick up on. So obsessive jealousy
Mm.
is like one of the key red flags.
What
So,
might that look like?
okay, so it's not like, you just talk to your ex and I feel a little bit insecure. That's not, no, okay, I get that. It is like being accused of flirting with every single male around. Like I
Mm.
remember not being able to go to the grocery store because if I'm staring at the produce thinking, well, gee, are the kids going to want broccoli tonight or are they going to want green beans? I'm not really sure which looks freshest. So I'll just stand there looking for a while and finally decide on my vegetable. Then after we leave the store, there's an incident where he's like, you were staring at that guy in the produce section. I know you were. I know you want to sleep with him, don't you? I bet you're having an affair. So it's
Oof.
like that over and it's like, what? So it's not insecurity. People are insecure, and we get that. It is over the top accusations of cheating, accusations of flirting constantly, and you're not doing anything. And like, so the victim gets to the point where like they just want to isolate. I don't want to go out in public. can't.
Right.
Too dangerous. So that's what that looks like. So that's another red flag. And those are kind of like the early warning signs, and usually like the abuse doesn't start until there's some major change, like marriage,
Right.
or
Right.
something like that. And then um, abusers generally have Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde personalities,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
you don't know. You're walking on eggshells, like, you know. And there's a lot of demeaning, a lot of criticism, a lot of, I mean, the red flags there's a lot of them.
Is there kind of like a lot of, because I've read a lot about this too. It seems to me that there's a correlation between domestic violence and narcissism, or like borderline personality types, that kind of thing.
Right.
And a lot of almost backhanded complimenting as well. So it's like you're not really sure what they're saying, exactly what they're saying. Like what they're
Yeah.
saying stings, but it's kind of sort of supposed to come off like passive aggressive, you
Yeah.
know? So there's a lot of that, which maybe kind of convolutes what's going on. You don't really know if it is a compliment and they're just like wording it poorly, or if they're trying to pick away at your self-worth and your self-esteem.
Yep. And that's exactly what it does, is you're not sure. And then you doubt yourself and you're like, well, I just don't get it. And he says I don't get it. And a lot of times he'll either say outright that you're stupid, or they're the more covert, like make hints that you're stupid. And so then when you
Mm,
like, is this an insult or isn't, then you're like, I guess I really am stupid. But before you know it, you're thinking you're stupid. I mean, it just really snowballs. But it is so often, I mean, not all abuse is covert, but a
right.
lot of it is
Mhm.
so covert that you just doubt yourself. You're
Mhm.
like, I don't know what's going on. I don't know. So then you get in this fog, and what makes it even worse is the abuse cycle. So
Yeah.
when you're in an abusive relationship, it's not like you're being attacked all the time and you're living with this monster 24/7 and, oh, this is horrible. It's a cycle. So first you have, it's just a tension buildup where you feel this tension, and maybe there's little comments being made, but they're so subtle that you're just not sure. Maybe it's your imagination. You're being too sensitive, right? So that goes on for a while, and then there's the big blow up. Something happens, or he'll make something happen, and all of a sudden there's like this big explosion of it takes different forms depending on what type of abuser. It can be physical abuse, it can be physical violence to inanimate objects, slamming doors, breaking things, a verbal attack, whatever, but something really big. After that, the abuser feels contrite, or you start to pull away, so he wants to draw you back in. So there's the calm time. The calm time is when you get apologies and flowers, and you're like, okay, he didn't mean it. It's okay. It really didn't happen the way I remembered. You begin to doubt yourself again. He's being so nice. You just love him so much. You just want to accept that, yeah, he's going to change this time. And then it starts all over again. And so that's why it's so difficult. And that leads to trauma bonding also, where you're just like, he's the one attacking you, but he's also the one making you safe during the calm stages. So it's crazy is the only word to describe it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's so interesting about that is that when you get used to being in an abuse situation, you talk about the way that that conditions your brain, your psychology, because our brains are really powerful. And so, for example, when somebody is gaslighting you all the time or picking away at your self worth and saying things to you, even if it's not true, you hear it enough, and you hear this with children. Like you hear something enough, you start to believe it. But part of that is that there are certain neurons firing in the brain telling you certain messages, and the more often you hear them or even start saying them to yourself, the faster those neurons fire. And so what happens is you habituate this kind of thought in
Mhm.
your mind, And that's why one reason why it can take a really long time for somebody to realize that they are in an abusive situation, because
Yeah.
their brains have already habituated this is their normal, and they've already internalized all these messages about their self-worth, their perception of reality. They've learned that their reality and their perception of it is not trustworthy because they've been told it's not trustworthy. So when you sort of realized that you were in this abusive situation, what was that like for you?
At first I didn't believe it. I'm like, no, that can't be it. No. So there's a lot of denial going on because you don't want it to be true. But at the same time, I mean, being a writer, I am by nature a researcher. So I'm
Mhm.
like, I'm going to just read everything that I can. And so I'm grabbing all these books, and the first books that I didn't really come across I didn't come across any Catholic books, and didn't really come across very many Christian books. So they were all the secular books. So Lundy Bancroft's Why Does He Do That? Was like the premier book on domestic abuse. And that was the first one I picked up. And I think my copy is completely highlighted. So, I'm like, yep, I'm checking everything off, but still like, then no, he's not that bad. It can't be, no. So just a lot of denial, but then things are still going on. And at some point through prayer, reflection, and just reading more, I'm like, I can't deny it anymore. And
Mhm.
another key thing, and I recommend this to anyone in an abusive relationship, is journaling. So you forget a lot during that calm phase of the abuse cycle. It's called abuse amnesia. I mean, I have forgotten serious abusive incidences, and then I'll reread them. That's something I wrote in my journal from years ago, and I'm like, how could I ever have forgotten? But it's wiped out of my mind.
Yeah, and that's a defense mechanism of the brain
It
for
absolutely
trauma.
is.
And
Yep, you
yeah,
can't deal with that much trauma.
yep.
At the beginning of an abusive relationship, the abusive incidences are fewer and far between. So, like you said, you get kind of used to it,
Hmm.
and so by the time you realize that it's just so. And a lot of times too, you're like, oh, maybe he didn't really say that, or maybe I interpreted it wrong. So when you write it down, like in the moment, as much as you can, right after, you just can't deny anymore. You're like,
Hmm.
no, I need help, or I
Hmm.
need to do something. Something has to change, especially when, like for me, I was in deep depression, very isolated. I mean, like when COVID hit, that didn't change my life at all.
Wow, that's hard to imagine.
I was like, great, I just have an excuse to stay home. I don't have to feel bad about myself for always doing it, because I was self isolating. I was living COVID life years before COVID hit,
Mm.
just not wanting to go out. So, yeah, at some point, it just is like, seeing how it hurt my children.
Yeah.
Then once I saw that, I'm like, no, I have to get to the point where I can admit it. And that took prayer, like just going to our Lord and just being like, help me to really see the truth, as I don't want to falsely accuse, but I know I need help.
Mm.
So,
Yeah, and that your children witnessing that, um and you want to break that cycle for them, right? Like you want them to grow up and marry into relationships that are healthy. But there is this phenomenon where we tend to seek out partners that remind us of our parents, especially those of the opposite sex, right? That's a psychological phenomenon that happens somewhat commonly, and we have a duty as parents to our children to model for them a good marriage,
mm.
and to protect them. And would you say for a lot of survivors of domestic violence that one of the biggest, or maybe even the biggest impetus for getting out of that situation would be for the sake of children? Because it seems to me that is like the biggest thing for women that I've noticed working in pro-life work. Getting out of those situations, often it's for the sake of their children, because they perceive a threat to their children, and they're that's what drives them at that point. It's not even for themselves.
Well, I mean, definitely when your kids are attacked, that's the end. That's not the end, but I mean, everyone's situation is different. Yeah, I mean, for some women, they stay. because of the
Mhm.
kids. Like, oh, I have to keep this marriage together. But others, when it gets too dangerous, and danger is not just physical danger. That emotional
Right.
danger to a child in that situation is very devastating.
Well, and let's talk about that too. We sort of touched on it before we started the broadcast. I mean, I would love to hear what your husband thinks of your work now, years later, before we kind of get into the phase of, um, what's going on now and what your situation is like. But too, the psychology of someone who is an abuser. Now, this isn't ever going to be unilateral. Again, every situation is different, but what are some commonalities that you've seen from your research, and how does that comport with your experience in terms of how your husband became this person? Because no child grows up thinking that they're going to be like that, you
Right.
know?
Right. Well, one of the most interesting things that my research that I discovered researching was there's actually four abuser types generally. And of course, I mean, it's not an exact science, but you have like type 1, and they're the antisocial, um, personality disorder, actual having narcissistic personality disorder, things like that. Those are people who really aren't going to change. And change is always possible, but those, they just don't want to, and and they're like that in their life, not just in their relationship. And then you have like the family only, and the family only, he's the one who only abuses in the home, but very infrequently. So abuse is like maybe 6 times a year, I think is the average, not much. And then you have the low level antisocial, which is basically like a low level personality disorder. Then you have the most common, and this is someone with, I say, narcissistic tendencies, borderline tendencies, but not like a personality disorder. It's only in their intimate relationship. They're the cyclical abusers, so they abuse in that cycle. Um, and all those personality types, it really is childhood. I mean, a childhood is when our personality is forming, and something happens in childhood that causes their emotional development to get stunted. And it's not just one factor, and everyone's personality is different. So, I mean, there are people that, let's say you grew up in an abusive household, you could grow up and become an abuser. You could grow up and become a victim because that's what you're used to, or not. I mean, everyone's different, but generally, there are characteristics. There's what's called ACEs, like adverse childhood effects of like, have you been physically abused in your childhood, sexually abused, things like that, neglected. So being neglected by your parents, or told you just don't matter, or you're a nuisance, that's abuse. And that's really difficult for a child. And so when they grow up in that environment, their emotion and their attachment style to their parent is like I said, stunted. So then when they grow up and have intimate relationships, they don't know. It's just, there's a lot of problems.
Like, yeah, like I said, people don't just grow up wanting to be like this, but that doesn't mean that you have to subject yourself to this. Like
Right.
it's not an excuse. We shouldn't use it as an excuse, but it is important to be aware that these things develop. They don't People aren't born innately to be like this, where we actually have a desire for love. And it's it's like there's this really good book. I recommend everybody read it. And maybe you've read it, but it's called Born for Love: Why Empathy is Essential and Endangered.
I haven't.
It's really, really good. And it talks a lot about how empathy has been killed within like a micro sense. It's two psychologists that write this. Um, and they talk about people they've worked with, and in terms of like therapy and things like that, and how they became basically psychopaths, or were healing from trauma, because people, like you said, we have different dispositions. Some people are naturally more resilient than others. Some take on more of a victim mentality, or they become cut off. They stop bonding with people if their attachments early on in childhood have been constantly ripped from them. So for example, I can think of one kid who was a legitimate sociopath, and a big thing looking at his childhood was that his mom was working, And so they would hire nannies to take care of him. And the mom would get jealous at the bond that he was developing with the nanny, so she kept hiring new nannies. So every time he got close to somebody, they were ripped away from him. And so he developed a coping mechanism to not be connected to anybody, to
Mhm.
not have
Yeah.
any sort of attachment. And this is where you get into attachment theory and all of that. But it was significant for him because then he became an extraordinarily cruel teenager. I mean, horrific crimes. So anyway, it talks about this, and then others, you go to places like Russia, they have orphanages where there are so many children in these orphanages and not enough hands to hold them, and babies need to be held. And so they would just like let these babies cry it out for
Mhm.
hours and hours and hours until eventually they stop crying. And they ask, well, why is it that the babies stop crying? Is it because they learn to self-soothe? Well, no, babies aren't capable of self-soothing at that age. What happens is that they learn that no one's going to come to their aid. No one's going to be there. And so they just stop as a coping mechanism. And that really stunts their ability to connect and bond with other human beings, especially having already been separated from their mother, and hence why they're in the orphanage in the first place. So just really fascinating book, but then it looks at it on a larger scale of, well, what does this mean in terms of economics and how we interact with each other in the world and within the family and things like that. It's just a really fascinating book. But to your point, these things don't happen, but they do have implications further on. So, once you realized you were in this relationship and you realized it was, in fact, a, an abusive relationship, how did you and your husband move forward from that? Because you're kind of rare insofar as you are still married to him and he supports the work that you do. So, would
Yeah.
you care to explain that a little bit? I'm sure that because that's not the norm.
So no, it's not the norm. So yeah, the attachment theory thing that you were mentioning is really interesting because a lot of what happens when you have attachment issues is like you want to be attached to someone and you want to love so much, but you're afraid of it, so then you'll push it away, and that abuse is kind of like pushing it away, you know?
Mhm.
So I mean, when I realized what was going on, it wasn't like an instantaneous like, oh, there, just flick the switch and I talked to him and he's great now. It's wonderful.
Right.
I would talk to him. I would write him letters. I'd be like, I can't tolerate this anymore. One more incident and I'm out. Another incident would happen, and no, I'm not out because I'm trauma bonded big time. Um, so it took years until just finally, with a lot of prayer and a lot of support from family, I'm just like, I can't. Myself is so gone that I just can't do this anymore, because I'm a child of God and God loves me. So I have to start loving myself. And there was just, it kind of hit a climax, one big incident where he was actually like, I think I need to leave. And that for him, that was like an eye-opening thing. For him to leave and for me to say, yeah, I'm actually at the point where I can say that I will divorce you if things don't change. And that's often what it takes for an abusive personality to actually change. You know, granted, most of them don't, but some of them do. And it usually takes the end of the relationship or something big, like, cancer diagnosis or something like that. But it takes a big shift in their world. Um, so, but I had to come to the point where I'm like, honestly, no more saying I'm going to leave, because that doesn't do anything but just reinforce things that I'm not going to, but actually be like, it has to change. Um, and there was just something internal within him, through his own spiritual life and his own journey, and really not wanting to be that person. It was his work, but I'm like, you can go do your work. I'm going to do mine. And, but change is a difficult topic because an abuser will often say that he's going to change.
Yeah, yeah.
That's the calm stage of the abuse cycle. And you can get separated and be separated 2, 3 months, whatever. And oh, he's good for this is a long time. So bring him back into the home, and it starts all over again. You
Well,
know,
let's talk about that too, because this is something I think we is so important as Catholics we need to talk about is the church's teaching on divorce and separation, especially in these situations, because it seems like, I mean, there's a part of me that thinks, okay, annulments are kind of handed out like candy a little bit. Like there's not, um, it just feels like divorce is so prevalent in the church, and why is that? And then on the other hand, um, there are these legitimate situations, and domestic situations are legitimate, but people will still point to like amazing saints who stayed with their abusers until they died and had a deathbed confession or what have you. So like, how do we bring this together with a true Catholic understanding of marriage, domestic violence, and in light of some of the saints that we hold in such high esteem? Because um, I just feel like there are really conflicting messages. And so, how do you, as a survivor, sort of look at that?
there's definitely conflicting messages. And when I started out on my journey of healing, I'm like, what? How do I deal with this? And that's kind of why I started my website. Was like wanting to gather all the really good Catholic information in one place, so that other women wouldn't have to do all the research I was doing. They just can be like, okay, resources. Here's these links. Wonderful things. But the Catholic Church teaches very, very clearly that if you're in an abusive relationship, there is no requirement for you to stay. And that's in the Code of Canon Law, which I want to get to in a minute, because then they say something else very interesting. But, you know, if you read the Catechism of the Catholic Church on marriage, it's, mutual self-giving. It's for the good of the spouse. It's for, everything.
And
It's
their children, yeah.
in the children, and the opposite of what an abusive relationship is. And I think it was in 1992, and then rewritten in 2002. The USCCB put out a document, which unfortunately not a lot of Catholic women are aware of, but everyone needs to read this. It's called When I Call for Help.
Hmm.
And it is their document on domestic violence. And it covers, it's not long, but it packs a punch. And it really covers what the Catholic Church teaches. And it says under no circumstances should you feel obligated to stay.
Hmm.
Especially, if you're in danger, there's no obligation to stay.
Right.
The Code of Canon Law says that you should separate if you feel you're being threatened or you're in an abusive situation, whatever, separate. But then the next little note says, once the reason for your separation is no longer, then you should get back together.
Mm-hmm.
That's really, really tricky for abusive women, because we go back to that abuse cycle where is change real? In most cases, it's not. I can't tell you how many times, oh, I'm changing. No,
Mm-hmm.
but you always hold on to that hope. And unless you know the signs of real change, and if you're still completely trauma bonded and traumatized, it's really, you just want to cling to that hope. So unfortunately in the church, a lot of clergy and lay ministers, like the annulment advocates and things like that, are undereducated. They don't know about domestic abuse or what the church teaches. So they'll read in Code of Canon Law, well, okay, you should get back together. He's being good now, not realizing, well, this is just another turn of the abuse cycle. And the abuse could just end up being worse unless you really know for sure that there's change. And in order to know for sure there's change, he has to do tremendous work. Tremendous. It takes an extremely strong character to actually change.
That makes so much sense too, because kind of going back to what I was talking about earlier, excuse me, you have these cycles of thought that are habituated, and they start in early childhood, right? And for the abuser, um, so these cycles of thought and insecurities that they may have about, or attachment issues, they've habituated for a very long time. It's become a part of their identity. It's how they've crafted relationships for a long time now. That's their normal.
Mhm.
So they don't see that it's abusive. They see this as they're experiencing rage, and this is how they have habitually expressed rage at other people, especially people who in intimate relationship with them, because that's their safe place. It's kind of like kids who haven't learned to regulate their emotions, and they might go off to like daycare or school during the day, and they were really good, but they come home and they emotionally crap all over you. I mean, they like come home and they're just an emotional wreck. They're tired, and they were good all day, and then all of a sudden they get to their safe space, which is mom, and they're awful. They can be really horrible to you, and not behaving and nasty. And it's kind of like that with the abusive spouse. I feel like, that emotional regulation, that ability to down regulate when they're experiencing those big emotions that we talk about with kids. um, it's like what you said earlier. It has to do with the lack of maturity forming within the brain, and learning how to regulate properly. And so with somebody who's abusive, I mean, there now you have decades of that habituation in the brain. And so it is really hard for them to go back and rehabilitate and find new neural pathways to create new habits, and to reshape how they interact with the world around them.
And their attitudes. I mean, it's in
Yes.
their attitudes. They don't even know. Like, one really, really common thing for an abusive man to do, especially someone who hasn't yet been physically abusive, but maybe this is a sign that he may be, punching holes in walls. I cannot tell you how many times. That's like my number one hit on my website, is punching holes in walls abuse.
Oh, Lord have mercy.
It is the number one. Yes, it is. Throwing things to like smash against the wall, usually the victim's things, slamming doors like in a rage, like breaking the door frames. And I've heard women tell me, well, he just said that that's what guys do. That's normal. So I guess it's normal.
Mm,
That's what guys do, right? No.
no.
Abusive guys do, yes. But
Mm.
guys, no.
Right, because like real men properly formed have a desire to protect, like they're not interested in intimidating their wives or girlfriends or
But the abuser really is not lying to, I can't say all the time, but most of the time is not lying to, his victim when he's saying this is what guys do. That's what he really thinks. That's the attitude that
Yes.
he grew up in. So, and going back to childhood, it could be the role models that he had in childhood were, or if he's left to himself and neglected, what is he watching on TV?
Yeah.
You know? I don't know how, I mean, when I was going through my own, the really the tough part of the healing process, I'm just like, I want to relax tonight and watch a TV show. Just a fun, whatever. And it's really hard to watch just any, like a G-rated TV. No, I'm not talking, Showtime or anything ridiculous like that.
Yeah.
Just any show, but like how many times couples slap each other? I would jump, like I would start to have an anxiety attack because they're slapping each other. And I'm like, this is, and then they kiss and oh, yay. Yeah. This is normal on TV and movies. And we see, I never really realized how often I saw that until, I really started getting aware and started having these PTSD symptoms and flashbacks to that stuff. So yeah, I mean, it's just in the cultural attitude a lot of times, and just, it's so ingrained, like to actually change. So one of the things that if someone who has an abusive personality really wants to change, well, first, thank God.
Right.
I can't imagine changing without God. And I mean, I minister to a lot of women, and my ministry is Catholic. I can't imagine ministering to women on a secular level, because I how many times I say, go to prayer, go to adoration, for an abuser, stop going out to bars and join the Knights of Columbus or something like that. Have different role models, but you get a spiritual director, just your own spiritual journey. But an abuse intervention program is one thing that absolutely is a must in a group with other men. And this can be really, really hard for an abuser who's not been physically abusive. So there's no court mandated. He never went to jail, nothing like that. He has to be self-referred.
Mm.
There's a lot of the men in these programs are court referred and they don't want to be there. They're just like, but they have to be. And if you find a really quality one,
It's life-changing.
it's life changing. And that was the game changer, because it was like if you have a really good one, the people who are moderating it, well, it's tough love is what these programs are. There's no coddling. There's no, like, if an abuser can go to therapy, more times than not, they're going to get coddling. Oh, abusers have high level of self-shame. That's the narcissistic bit. So there's a lot of that self-shame that they can't admit to themselves. So it has to come out in different ways. So they go to
And
therapy.
pride. Yeah.
Oh, so they're like, oh, yes, well, we'll do these change. It's like hand-holding. But in these intervention programs, it is tough love. It's like, this attitude is wrong. And
Which is what men need. And men respect that so much more. Like,
and they need to know where their attitudes are wrong, because they don't even realize what, like sarcasm, for example. That's a huge, huge toxic weapon. No, sarcasm is abusive when it's just used on this pattern and all the time. And,
that's a tough one, especially if you grew up around a lot of sarcasm, because I think a lot of us have grown up around sarcasm, and it becomes a part of your lectionary. And so when you're constantly being sarcastic, I've seen it in members of my own family where it stings. It's not funny anymore. It's not funny. It's always crossing the line. It's always going a bridge too far. And then when you point that out, they gaslight you. Like, that wasn't funny. That was just hurtful. Or, that was over the top. And they're like, what are you talking about? I was just kidding. Like, no, you weren't.
I'm sorry. You can probably hear that. My family's in Florida. Okay, so here I'll use an example of just an article that I wrote recently. So this was the example I used in the article. Like, okay, so you've had a really tough week, and your friends invite you to go out for the evening, and you're like, yeah, I really could use a girls' night out. So it's the middle of the calm part of the abuse cycle. So you think your husband will be okay with it, and you're like, oh, is it okay if I go out tonight with my friends? Oh yeah, go have fun. I'll have a good time with the kids, and whatever. So you go out and you come back, and maybe it's a little bit later than he expected, or whatever reason. And the sarcasm is, well, I'm so glad you had a good time tonight. Well, if you say, oh, I'm so glad you had a good time tonight. Oh, thank you. But it's like this subtle voice change. I'm so glad you had a good, and it's like this dig. But then you're like, does he really mean he's glad? Or, am I being too sensitive? And then as the night progresses, you realize, no, I'm not, because then something happens, he'll add that, like, if you don't take the bait, then it'll get worse,
Or two, I think you'll see, like, sometimes things like that happen in marriage anyway, even to begin with. And so then there's a part of you where you're like, is this just like a normal, like, couples, whatever, like, it was a misunderstanding. He
Right.
thought I was going to be home earlier. And then, but what often happens too is that when things start to spiral downward, and I'm not speaking from experience, I love psychology. I'm a psych nerd. Not that I know everything about it. Like, that's what I wanted to study when I was much younger. Family therapy, all that stuff is really fascinating to me. But even later in that abuse cycle, it will get brought up again later, and it will be used against you. That's part of the abuse too. I mean, it's one thing when you're having just a couple's disagreement, there was a misunderstanding, and they're upset and being passive aggressive with you. It's a whole nother thing when they will not let it go, and it's used as leverage against you. And I think that's really important to distinguish those two situations.
Exactly. Everyone has misunderstandings in marriage and arguments, but abuse is a pattern.
And that's the other thing too, is why women might not always pick up on it. Like, they might think that was just a spat that we had. We just have a lot of spats.
And that's what he'll say, but then you recognize it's a pattern, and the same stuff keeps going, being brought up either in a slightly different costume or the same exact thing years later. I'm like, this was 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Haven't you? No, it gets brought up again and again. And, another thing about these relationships that get so difficult is, as the victim, you can't apologize. You have to apologize. But you can't apologize once. You have to grovel.
Right.
But you're going to pay for that apology too. You get to the point where where you're like, I legitimately did something I shouldn't have, and I should apologize, but I don't want to, because it's going to get thrown back up at me about like how bad I am. See, I told you were this bad person so even your apologies are weapons, even the ones where you didn't do anything, but you're forced to apologize, that's used as a weapon. So like, no matter what you say, no matter what you do, it'll eventually be used against you, even when like during the situation itself, you think everything's fine.
Right.
And then a day later, a month later, 2 years later, it's like, what?
Right.
Wait a minute,
So for where you are now, I mean, so your husband joined this group. What did you call it again?
It's an abuse intervention program.
An abuse intervention program. And did
And
he do therapy as well in conjunction with that, or what?
he tried individual therapy before, and again, it was the coddling. It was like, they're just like, oh, you're such a sensitive guy. You're so wonderful. You have so much shame. Just work on your shame, and everything's gonna be great.
Sounds like a really bad therapist.
I don't, but he had like, but who knows what?
Yeah.
I don't know. But it wasn't until the group. But then again, how do you know change is real?
Right.
Not by a person's words. Don't listen to them saying, I'm changing. Words don't mean anything. Abusers are notorious liars. They lie.
Compulsively. Yeah.
Compulsively, a big and little, they lie, which
Yeah.
is one of the most difficult things to get over. Like, how do I trust this person again?
Yeah.
So don't listen to words. It's actions. Can you actually talk to him? Is he listening? Is he listening without abuse, without excuses or abuse? Yeah. Is he taking accountability for his actions completely without saying, but? That word, but, doesn't mean. So, yeah, I'm really sorry that I called you that name last night, but I had too much to drink. I don't care. I don't care. There's no excuse. But I'm sorry I did this, but you triggered something from my childhood, my old childhood wound, because they'll use that too. They know. They do psychology too. So and early on in the relationship, you're like, oh, the childhood wound. You feel so empathy,
Right.
but not an excuse. So can you talk to him without excuse? He's not excusing. He's not blaming. There's open communication. You can say anything. If you're separated, is he rushing to get back together, or can you take your time? Again, with my husband, he knows everything that I do. I don't keep secrets. I don't lie. That's just who I am. So he's well aware. My website, my writing ministry, this podcast. He said he's praying for me and hopes that I do a good job, and he actually means it. That wasn't said in sarcasm. So again, it's the actions. Is this me being here today on your show? Is this going to be thrown up in my face next year, the year after, and used against me? No. After prayer and reflection and 2 years of being in this healing journey of change, I can say no. If I thought that it would, I wouldn't be here right now. But again, it's time, a lot of it, a lot. It's not months, it's years.
Right.
And not caring about his words. They're sweet, they're wonderful. It's actions.
Yeah, I'd imagine that's really tough if your love language is words of affirmation, like for me, but at the same time, if you grew up in an environment, or you are living in an environment where words haven't meant very much except for to be hurtful, then yeah, it is really, you will know a tree by its fruit, For all of us. It's all like that. I mean, let your yes mean yes and your no mean no. I mean, we're called to speak authentically in a way that um, correlates with our behavior. I mean, that's a duty that we have. We have to reintegrate ourselves that way, especially at a time where flattery is really common and things like that, where we're kind of living. We're used to living incongruently, and like for this person, for all of us, so there are these areas of our lives, like if you are in an abusive situation, you're used to living life incongruent. That's part of what makes it feel so unstable. But same too with the abuser. They might be saying one thing and doing something completely different.
Right.
And so really a lot of this is about reintegrating our hearts, our minds, and how we making sure that what we say and what we do are congruent,
Mhm.
and ordered towards God, ordered towards the love of our spouse and our children, things like that. So, what do you say to people who say, for example, well, like all these, Saint Monica, she lived with her abuser. So, what do you say to people who levy that? Because I think that's a really hard thing for anyone who's survived domestic violence to hear, or
Mhm.
somebody who has chosen to divorce their abuser. What do you say to them?
Yeah, I mean, I understand. I don't want to say anything bad about Saint Monica or Saint Rita because they're both wonderful
Yeah,
saints,
yeah,
but they lived in a different time where, they didn't have any options. Okay, so if Saint Monica decided to divorce, she would be a widow on the street. Not a widow, a divorced person, but she'd be completely shunned.
right.
There's no, well, I can rely on my career, I can rely on my family. No, the family is going to probably pretty much shun her too.
Mm,
Church, even, I divorced back then. I don't know what, would have gone on, but it was a different era. Would they have, you know, been more encouraging? There was no USCCB document when I call for hope, yeah, help rather. So, I mean, it is a different time. And so those saints were, while admirable for their fortitude and their patience, aren't really good role models, because if you stay in an abusive relationship, you're enabling that to continue. And yes, praying is wonderful, but you can also pray from afar.
mm. So, what would you say to somebody listening to this right now who is in an abusive situation, or maybe is realizing for the first time that they might be enduring abuse? I mean, because it doesn't sound to me, especially given your experience, you're not going to rush to tell them to get a divorce. You didn't do that yourself. Your position seems to be very nuanced, and so what would you say to them? Like, what are the first steps that they should take?
The first steps, they need to listen to themselves. Um, Believe it or not, most women in abusive relationships don't want a divorce. They want their abuser to change. Is he going to? Well, maybe, maybe not. But I would say that don't cling to the relationship based on the hope that he's going to change. That's the wrong reason. What you need to do is take control of your life and love yourself. It's not always the right thing for a woman to leave. It's not always the right thing for a woman to stay. You can't say. And in violent relationships, physically violent, leaving can be very dangerous. Most domestic murders happen when a woman is going to or has left. So in those cases, if I knew that there was physical abuse, I'd be like, all right, you need to formulate a safety plan. How do you do that? Well, I can help you. I've written a book. It's called "Don't Plant Your Seeds Among Thorns," and hopefully it'll be published soon. But I have a whole in the appendix, creating a safety plan. There are resources that I can point to, people online, but your local domestic violence shelters can help. There's just a lot of help out there. You just have to know where to go. Um, but telling a woman from the get-go, oh, just leave, is definitely the wrong thing to do, because she usually doesn't want to. She just wants to make things right. And how do you do that? Again, the first thing is to heal yourself and to heal that trauma bond, because trauma bond isn't love. And then go from there and pray and pray and pray and see, what is he going to do? What's his integrity? What is he, because again, abusers can and do change, but it is not common.
Yeah, what were the qualities that you saw within your husband that kind of gave you those indicators that he was really in it for the long haul and he was sincere? I mean, I know you kind of touched on it a little bit. You know, there were indicators in terms of patterns of behavior towards the good instead of the bad, where you could start to trust his actions. They were aligning with what he was saying more often. But what were those early indicators? Because how long were you prepared to wait it out, basically?
So there were no early indicators. I had to work on myself and had to be at that place where it's okay for me to leave, and I will.
Like complete resignation and surrender to the
Yeah,
situation.
yeah,
That's what
yeah.
you neneeded to get to.
And say to God, I am terrified of ending this relationship because I'm still trauma bonded and I'm still, it's terrifying. But if that's your will, I'm willing, and I know that you'll help me. Where will I go? Where will I live? What will it says in the Bible? Don't worry about those things. I'll just trust you. So it really had to come from within, and it had to come from a place of prayer. And so before I could even think about, is he really changing? You could drive yourself crazy. Is he changing? Is he not? You don't know. You don't know, especially early on. You just don't know. So don't drive yourself crazy. Just heal yourself first, and then, and pray and pray and pray. For me, trust is a huge issue. Like it's the foundation of a marriage for me, a foundation of any relationship. If you can't trust, you have nothing. And trust completely broken. When I discovered all the lies, and even just discovering he's abusive, that's like a break in trust. But then just everything, it's like no trust.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, when I will know when I get to the point of complete trust again. I'm not there. That's why we're still separated. But he's doing his own part, and there's no rushing. I'm doing my part, and I don't have to trust right now, but I do have to pray. And so in my prayer, and I do daily adoration and just take it before Jesus. Like, do I trust? And today I try. It's kind of like, you're an alcoholic. So you're like, today I am choosing not to take a drink. It's kind of like that. It's like, today, after praying, I feel like I can trust him. I can keep on the way we are now. I believe that he truly is changing one day at a time, sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's only I am sure that he is actually this time, but that only came through prayer and asking the Holy Spirit for wisdom. That's like my big prayer, is like, give me the wisdom of Solomon. That's what I pray for, because for me, the wisdom of Solomon means the complete wisdom of discernment, and just being so in tune with God's will that you just really can hear his small, still voice. Because that voice is so small, especially when you've been abused, and your voice of anxiety and PTSD is over the top louder than God's voice. You
Mm-hmm.
lose that ability to discern. You lose that ability to hear God. So when you slow down, sit down in prayer and just pray about it. And I'm not going to say your answers are going to come all of a sudden. It takes time. And if there's anyone out there who thinks, maybe I'm going to give this a try to see if he's going to change, you need to know it is hard work on both sides. And it is painful work. It's extremely painful.
Mm-hmm. Well, I really appreciate you sharing your story today on Integrated. It's just such an intimate thing to let people into that, and to give so much wonderful insight into this really difficult issue of domestic violence. So, especially this month in October, we know it's Respect Life Month, but also respecting the lives within our homes in this way. Really important stuff. So, where can people find out more about your work and kind of wait on your upcoming book?
Well, I have several websites, because I have like 2 Substack newsletters. One's the domestic abuse, and one is just Catholic. And then I have my domestic violence website. But then if you just go to jennyduBay.com, and click about me. And then there's other, like, you can click my articles. Basically everything is put together on jennyduBay.com. So from there you can find my Substack newsletters. From there, there'll be updates on the book. Right now I'm just waiting to hear back from a publisher. So, prayers. But I definitely will update everyone. They've been asking. So I'm like, yeah, I'll believe me, I'll update the website as soon as I hear anything. But yeah, just jennyduBay.com.
We can find all of that.
And that's probably, that's the easiest place. So,
excellent.
And anyone can feel free to contact me at any time. I answer every single email. I might not be super quick depending on how many I get, but a lot of people will contact me just with their own questions or whatever. And I just really try to honor everybody's place in their own healing journey and what they need. And so any questions, anything, there's a real person attached to the website.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming on today, Jenny. I'll be praying for you. I hope everyone that listens to this episode is praying for you and all survivors of domestic violence, and praying for their abusers for that true, authentic conversion that we also desperately need to embark our own journeys for. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
God bless you.
You too.